Well, welcome back to our Common Sense Conversations, I think is what we're calling it, right?
It works.
And, this is all about common sense. We were just talking about some stories that we appreciate about history and how the great leaders in history were the ones that knew where they were going and knew what was right and wrong and weren't afraid. They weren't necessarily considered the nice guys. They weren't the popular by, this is my best friend. These were guys that knew what was right and wrong. And so that's, I think, what we'd like to get across, right? Is these are common sense ideas, things that people should inherently know to be right and wrong, right?
Some of the people who have thought hard things over the years regarding financial policies, spoken out against certain government actions, maybe standing on the side of common sense when they saw the government doing something that made absolutely no sense. Some of those people might have been hard people to hang out with on occasion. I've asked myself this question sometimes: would I go fly fishing with that guy? And truth is, sometimes I don't know if I would. They might not be the guy I want to be hanging out with on the edge of the river, just enjoying a sunny day, casting flies. But when it comes to discussing economics and fiscal policies and the consequences of those policies and how to prepare and protect us against the unintended negative consequences of those policies, I definitely want them sitting at my table.
Oh, absolutely.
Absolutely.
And if you're joining us for the first time, my name's Eric Jones.
Matt Rust.
And we're excited to be with you today.
Yep. So last week, we were talking about some of the numbers on the national debt. We didn't make it down to unfunded liabilities and some of the consequences and what those unfunded liabilities, the dollar amounts, what that means for our futures as individuals, as families, and frankly, just as Americans in general. We could recap briefly. National debt, 28 trillion. Number of workers today is less than it was 20 years ago. Number of people paying taxes and less than it used to be. Government revenue has gone up in general, which is good, but there was an article that I just read just a few days ago, printed a copy off here. In the Wall Street Journal this last week, a story came out, and in that story, the writer had written this, that the Congressional Budget Office last Wednesday said that federal debt held by the public is projected to reach or exceed 100% of U.S. gross domestic product, GDP, the broadest measure of U.S. economic output, in the fiscal year that begins October 1st this year. That would put the U.S. in the company of a handful of nations with debt loads that exceed their economies, including Japan, Italy, and Greece. If you look back through history, you'll find countries who have declared bankruptcy. At a certain point, they just couldn't handle the debt load. The U.S. arguably has the largest economy in the country. Largest economy in the world. And a lot of people think that we're too big to fail. I'm not so sure if we're too big to ever fail. I don't think that our economy will fall as quickly as other economies did once they reached that tipping point. It'll take us longer, but if we continue on the trajectory that we are on, there's no doubt that it will get worse, not better. So back to what we were discussing today.
I think just to jump in there,
Sure.
I think that along that line of thought, that if it did fail, people think that it's too big to fail. Well, that mere fact should scare us, because if it did fall, the fall is going to be bigger given the size of our economy, bigger than anything we've ever known of in history, right?
That's a good point. And if we have that opinion that we are too big to fail, we'll be less prepared if and when it happens, right?
Oh, for sure.
And if that slippery slope that ends in our economy failing is wrought with very high interest rates or very high inflation rates, possibly approaching hyperinflation that other countries have experienced, we are less prepared for those times. And in fact, I don't remember if I brought this up in the first one. I have some friends who are all about preparing for a zombie apocalypse. And it's comical on the one hand, because none of us really believe that zombies like we see in the movies, we don't believe that that's really going to be a thing. But it's kind of fun to talk about, joke about, play a video game where you shoot them all, right? But when I brought this up to them, I said, why are you preparing for a zombie apocalypse? Like reality, they are really preparing for it. And so I had to ask these questions. And they told me that it's not so much whether or not zombies are going to come along. Maybe they do, maybe they don't, who cares? But if I'm prepared for a zombie apocalypse, I'm prepared for anything.
The worst case scenario
Yeah.
is zombies.
Yeah.
You're like,
And I figured that whether or not the economy fails to the degree other countries have, if we prepare for that, then we're going to be better off than somebody else who wasn't as prepared, right? And in this big wide world, one of my favorite authors in talking about economics teaches that all of us are drawing money out of the same pool, just like there's only one pool of water in the world. Sometimes it's in the Pacific Ocean, sometimes it's in the Atlantic Ocean, sometimes it's in the Indian Ocean, sometimes it's in a reservoir down the road from us, right? Sometimes it's up in the sky like it is right now, falling. The truth of it is, it's all part of the same supply of water, right?
yeah.
So when something happens in an economy, it will affect everybody else's personal economies, and it's all relative. So if the time comes that we are just working with cash, or we are working with other assets or money in order to make purchases, the guy who has more is still going to be better off. Even if that more is not worth as much as it used to be, it's still more than what somebody else has. And the only reason that bread costs what it does at the store, the only reason that ears of corn cost what they do at a farmer's market, is because the buyers agree to pay that price.
Yep.
So if I'm able to buy more, I'll be better off than somebody who wasn't as prepared, right? Mm-hmm. That to me is common sense. And as we look at the US debt clock and jump back into those numbers, I try to approach this from that same perspective of what makes sense. So looking at those numbers, national debt, fewer workers in the workforce right now, GDP is going up for the most part. We are inflating the money supply more in 2020 than we have any other year, so much more in 2020 because of those stimulus packages. And now what's the consequence of that? Also looking at the long-term unfunded liabilities. You know, last week we had that computer up with it flipped around so people could see those numbers.
You want me to do it real quick?
Yeah, if you can on that computer, we should do that. We'll have that rolling in the background.
You know, while you're pulling that, or while I'm pulling that up, going back to the zombie idea, have you ever seen Studio C? Are you?
A little bit.
So my family and I love the show Studio C, right? It's a BYU group, right? Anyway, so they do this episode on zombies, right? And it you know, really funny. Watched it multiple times with the kids. It's great. But basically, the premise is that zombies are coming to attack this group of people, and everybody's like, "Oh, what are we gonna do? You know, the end's coming!" Da da da. And you know, one guy, speaking common sense, right? You know, stands in front of the group. No, look. All you have to do is walk away. You just have to turn and walk away, right? I mean, look at they're walking 1 mile an hour, right? They're just, so he's like, "Hey, just walk away, move away, and you'll be fine. You'll be fine." No, they're coming, you know, and no, look, they're getting closer. Look, you guys, just walk away, just move, you know, do something else, do something different than what you're doing. And so that's kind of the thought that I have, is that with these conversations of common sense, we look at the debt clock, we look at all these things, and all that we have to do, really, I mean, this is obviously oversimplifying it, right? But the idea is, we know the solution is to spend less than you make, right?
Sure.
We know that that's the solution. But so anyway, you go ahead. I'm going to jump into the debt clock here, like I said I would.
I think that building on that, we can walk away from some of the problems that the country is facing, some of the problems congressional spending has created over the last 20 years. We can walk away from some of those problems, though, you're right. A lot of us have a large portion of our savings in places that are controlled by Congress, controlled by rules and laws of Congress. Go down to the unfunded liabilities in the bottom right.
Unfunded liabilities.
All the way down to the bottom, then over to the right. And if we are able to save our money someplace, where it isn't controlled by Congress or controlled by our employer and Congress, we can contribute as much as we want. We control access to that money. And one of the big kickers, looking at the numbers on this debt clock, one of those big factors that isn't discussed often enough are the future tax rates that will be applied towards that savings. And way too few of us have money in savings, someplace we control it, someplace we have access to it, and someplace where it's not subject to taxes in the future. And if anything came out of this pandemic this last year, I think all of us are very aware that not nearly enough of us have enough money in savings. If it hadn't been for those stimulus packages, a lot of folks would have been in a lot of trouble. And there's no question about that. If, on the other hand, over the last 20 years, if we as Americans in general had been taught to save our own money someplace where we have access, where we control it, we wouldn't have relied so heavily on stimulus packages. And not that something wouldn't have been sent out. I don't know how much of that was because the crying of the people demanding, needing some kind of a stimulus like that. And I don't know exactly how they factored the numbers. I've wondered about that sometimes. How did they decide how much each family gets? And how many of those families were actually saying, give me some, give me some? I know a lot of people who, for them, that money was extra money. And they spent it on extra things, right? Mm-hmm. But each one of them knew that if they send it back, they're missing out on what everybody else is getting. So to keep things even, they went ahead and took it. A lot of businesses were in that same position, realizing that, well, we can continue operations, we have our own reserves, but if my competitors take $30,000 to $60,000 and I don't, they're going to be able to buy higher priced products and resell those, and I'm not going to be able to. So to keep things even, a lot of them took those stimuluses. Doesn't mean they needed it. Excuse me. And it certainly doesn't mean that it was right to put that debt load on us in order to fund those things.
Yeah, there's actually a comment here that I really appreciate. This is a article that you had brought in, and I read it. And let's see here. He makes
discussing the fall of Chile's.
No, wrong one. There we go. Where he makes an important point that I think really ties into that. He says, Friedman outlined the 4 types of spending, right? You can spend your own money on yourself.
Friedman, right?
Yes. You can spend your own money on yourself, someone else's money on yourself, or your own money on someone else. Either way, you have at least some incentive to spend discernibly. However, there's one other type of spending. I can spend somebody else's money on somebody else. Friedman concluded, and if I spend somebody else's money on somebody else, I'm not concerned how much it is, and I'm not concerned about what I get. And that's government. And I think that's government debt, right? That's when we look at the government and we say, take care of me, and our politicians are hired based on what we demand, and we don't see. I told you just before this meeting that about this experience that I had with a business owner, that his son took over his business in California. He moved here from California. His son took over the business, and his son, although he was a hard worker, knew all sorts of things about. He was an electrician, took over the lighting the showroom, the lighting business, and got the first check in the mail for $100,000, and said, "Oh, all right, $100,000. We earned $100,000. I'm going to go out and buy me a new truck." Well, it wasn't very long after that before the business was run to the ground, before it went out of business. They were, and he couldn't even sell the business. They had so much debt that he couldn't even sell the business. And I fear that that's where we're going. The American people have this mindset that the government is designed to take care of me, and they have no idea where all the liabilities lie. That out of that $100,000, in the words of this business owner, his son didn't realize that only $5,000 was his to spend. $95,000 was to take care of liabilities, and we have to wake up to the idea that there are more liabilities out there than just paying for our next TV set, right?
And so Congress, it sounds like you're saying that Congress is receiving that money and buying trucks instead of paying obligations. And maybe the short-term debt might be them going out and paying cash for that truck, spending money they don't have in that year, right? And then the suckers are going to go out and sign a note, a promissory note, to pay off a $5 million mansion somewhere. And whoever is selling it to them is saying that you don't even have to start paying on it right now. So we aren't paying on it right now. We're not paying towards these long-term, I broke it into long-term and short-term debt for simplicity's sake a while ago, but these unfunded liabilities are going to crop up at some point. We have this liability hanging over ourselves out there. We're buying trucks every single year, and then we're buying these big mansions and not thinking about how in the world we're going to pay for them. So those liabilities, the main ones that are listed here, are Social Security and the Medicare liability. The two of those combined only totals $50 trillion.
So you have, I'll scoot up, there's Social Security and Medicare liabilities on there.
Yeah. And depending on which economist you talk to and exactly which liabilities are added into this, this clock shows 162 trillion total, but other estimates put that total closer to 200 trillion. We could put a link. Reason TV did a video in October of 2018 where they estimated closer to $200 trillion at that point in time. One of the interviews they conducted in that short video was a gal who is an economist working for the Heritage Foundation. She's of German descent, has an accent. You can tell that's where she came from and lived there for a while. It's always interesting to me speaking to people from other countries as we talk about economics and economic policies, especially if they are from a country that has experienced what we might be experiencing over the next 20 to 40 years as our economy continues headed the direction that it is. And her insight, I think, lends some credence to what they say in that video put out by Reason TV. So as we look at these unfunded liabilities, it's worth noting the liability per citizen. If it's far enough on that clock, we see $490,000 of liability per citizen. Now last week, we talked about the national debt, and it was broken down per citizen. It's also broken down per taxpayer. And these unfunded liabilities used to be broken down per taxpayer on this debt clock until about a year and a half ago. They removed the amount where it showed how much it was per taxpayer and just left this smaller amount up per citizen. When we divide that amongst taxpayers, we find that each taxpayer would have to pay over $1 million in order to fund these liabilities for our future.
Each taxpayer.
Over $1 million. So, unless you've written your $1 million check already and you're free from that, it's something that we all have to prepare for. And that might be the zombie apocalypse. If the economy doesn't flat out fail, then certainly Congress is going to look towards the working Americans who are earning that money towards that GDP, who are paying taxes, and they'll be looking for someone to pay off those liabilities. Or they print so much money to fund those liabilities that the rest of us in our savings loses incredible value, as we've seen other places.
So talking about other places, we're talking about the historical evidence that exists out there with concerning societies that have had to go through a type of reset, right? Mm-hmm. We cannot fathom the type of reset that we would have to go through, just as we can't fathom the debt. We can't fathom $1 trillion, much less 28 trillion, right? Yeah. We can't fathom that. We cannot fathom likewise what would need to happen in order for there to be a reset, right? And that's what scares me. That's why I want to be prepared for that zombie apocalypse myself. I'm going to join your friends. I'm going to be a zombie apocalypse guy now. Because that's in essence what we've got to prepare for almost.
In the near future, we'll talk about how we prepare financially, how we protect and preserve the wealth that we have, how we can help our children have access to that and inherit that wealth without the government taking their fair share, whatever they decide their fair share is 20, 30, 60 years from now. But it's important that we all protect against that. In fact, back to something you mentioned, the size of that debt that we have such a hard time fathoming. I think we forgot to mention that we've created a short video that we'll have on this channel as well, where we compare the national debt to time. How many seconds have to go by in order for us to reach 1 trillion seconds over history, for example. how many days or how many years can we spend $1 million per year or per day and spend $1 trillion? And then also, the YouTube channel Demonocracy has done various videos showing in imagery the size of the debt. Taking $100 bills stacked on pallets. How many pallets you'd have before you equal $1 trillion or $1 million. And it's really interesting to see that.
You sent it to me and my mind was blown.
Yeah, it's huge.
Yeah.
Even something as little, one of those images is this couch made out of $100 bills. And you look at that couch and say, okay, that's a 2-cushion couch. And all those $100 bills, okay, that's $1 million right there, stacked up. And it's just hard to fathom numbers that large.
Yeah.
So anyway, unless we're in the habit of buying Lamborghinis and Bugattis, we're not familiar with $1 million, but at least we can imagine what that's like. But 1 trillion is pretty difficult. So that video is going to be posted as well. It'll help you visualize that. Take those numbers, times it by 28, and you get to our national debt. Take those numbers and times them by 162, and you find our unfunded liabilities that we're on the hook for. And then tune in next time where we're going to talk about what we can do to prepare for our economic zombie apocalypse, I guess we're calling it. And we'll talk more about it next time. Thanks.
Goodbye from the zombie hunters.